hit pretty good pitches. What can I say? Just tip my hat and call the Yankees my daddies.
Game. The Red Sox were up by a run, a two-run lead, a three-run lead, but a seven-run lead.
Yeah, this seems like a completely normal interaction for a bunch of grown-ups to have. Whether you're a casual enjoyer or an absolute diehard, pretty much every baseball fan knows how the story of the 2004 Red Sox ended. Not many teams get the honest-to-God rom-com treatment, but honestly, these guys kinda earned it. But if you take a look under the hood, it becomes clear pretty quickly that by no means was this a guaranteed outcome. The 2004 Red Sox were a team that were surrounded all season long by narrative, so much so that there's definitely a universe where they got crushed underneath all of it and never even got close to this point. That incredible level of pressure started before this version of the team even reported for spring training, way back in October of 2003, when the Sox came tantalizingly close to reaching their first World Series since 1986, only to have those hopes snuffed out by the Yankees in the most painful way possible.
That might send the Yankees to the World Series. Boom, a hero in Game 7.
That home run came off the back of some absolutely prime playoff baseball narrative. The notion that Red Sox manager Grady Little had left star pitcher Pedro Martinez in the game for far too long, only to see Pedro give up the lead in the bottom of the eighth. That narrative led to another one, which was that Little was not the right man to lead the Red Sox in 2004. Star shortstop Nomar Garciaparra and Pedro Martinez were both in the last years of their contracts. The team had missed out on signing Alex Rodriguez in the offseason, and new manager Terry Francona had barely made a dent in 4 years with the Phillies. How did a team with this much uncertainty and pent-up trauma weighing them down wind up here? These questions are some of the most frequent discussion points in Faithful, a collaborative effort by Stephen King and Stuart Onan that chronicles the entire 2004 season, and I do mean the entire thing. Through email exchanges and nearly daily personal diaries, King and Onan share their thoughts on all kinds of things, from Terry Francona's bullpen strategy to the fate of Red Sox cult hero Brian Daubach to the team's ultimate success in the World Series. Reading their memories brought up so many things that I never knew or had just forgotten about that time in baseball history. And like many Red Sox fans, these two men share a particular antipathy towards the New York Yankees, especially after how the 2003 season ended. Stephen King has written some of the scariest stories in the history of modern America, but you know what scares him? The idea of his Red Sox losing to the Yankees again when it counted. And in 2004, that felt like a very real possibility. If the 2004 Red Sox had a flaw, it wasn't necessarily with their overall talent level. Their starting rotation featured two bona fide aces in Martinez and the recently acquired Curt Schilling, but Schilling was 37 and coming off a season where he missed a big chunk of time with injuries. Behind them were Derek Lowe, who had struggled with consistency as a starter, Tim Wakefield, who gave up that home run to Aaron Boone in Game 7, and Bronson Arroyo, who hadn't made a single start for the team the year before. What separated the Red Sox from teams like the Yankees wasn't their best players, it was their depth, and their occasional need to put slightly square pegs in slightly round holes to stay competitive. David Ortiz and Manny Ramirez anchored the middle of the lineup, but they shared that lineup pretty frequently with guys like Pokey Reese and Gabe Kapler. By the middle of June, the Red Sox were dropping 2 out of 3 to the very not good Colorado Rockies, and already sitting 4.5 back of the Yankees in the division. The team was good, but there were definitely still some concerns about it. And there's no better example of that than what was going on at the shortstop position. One of the strongest narratives that hung over this Red Sox team towards the beginning and middle of the season was what the team was going to do about Nomar Garciaparra. Now, I have to put my hand up here and say that while I knew that Nomar was good, he was in backyard baseball for crying out loud, until I started reading Faithful and researching for this video, I don't think I realized how good. In 2004, Nomar was entering his 9th season with the Red Sox, which was also the final year of his contract, and it's absolutely worth examining what he did in the first 8. From 1996 to 2003, Nomar Garciaparra accumulated 41 WAR, had an OPS of over 900, won 2 batting titles, and made 5 All-Star games. And he turned down an offer from the Red Sox for a 4-year, $60 million contract in 2003, which definitely sounds like a lot of money, but when you consider how much Derek Jeter, who Nomar stacks up against very favorably statistically, got in 2001, you can kind of see where he was coming from. For a basis of comparison, Nomar at that point had more WAR than infielders like Nolan Arenado, Francisco Lindor, or Manny Machado through their first 8 seasons. My guy wanted to get paid like one of the best players in the game, which his statistics showed he was. but he'd also struggled with injuries at various points and was continuing to do so in 2004. He wouldn't make his first start for the Red Sox until June, and wouldn't really start hitting like he used to until early July, at which point the Red Sox were already 8.5 games back at the Yankees. He and the team were no closer to a new deal either, and that would keep being a thing all the way up until the trade deadline. But in the meantime, Nomar's teammates were starting to show signs of what they could become in October. On July 24th, the Red Sox hosted the Yankees at Fenway Park, with the gap between the two teams still at 8.5 games. Stars like Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, and Curt Schilling were all having excellent seasons, but the Sox as a collective couldn't seem to put it all together for long enough to sustain a challenge for the division. But things started to change that night in late July, when third baseman Bill Miller did the not impossible but highly unlikely and took Mariano Rivera deep in the bottom of the ninth to win it for the Sox. It may have only been one game, but it showed a couple of things that would absolutely come back up later in this story. These Red Sox had a flair for the dramatic, and as evidenced by this dinger off the greatest closer of all time, the ability to make this Yankees team squirm a little bit. And they were just getting started. At the trade deadline, the Red Sox finally dealt Nomar to the Chicago Cubs in a 4-team deal that landed them shortstop Orlando Cabrera and first baseman Doug Mientkiewicz. It was very much the kind of trade that Brad Billy Pitbean over here would have been very proud of. Not replacing Nomar, because that was not going to happen, but adding pieces that could help replace his production for the Red Sox stretch run. This whole team was very Moneyball friendly, in fact. And as such, the 2004 Red Sox led the entire league in categories like on-base percentage and slugging and runs, and finished dead last in sacrifice bunts. Instead of using Keith Foulke exclusively in a traditional closer role, they instead used him as more of a relief ace that would come in at the most important moment of the game, regardless of what inning it was in. They successfully married Billy Beane's roster-building principles with the kind of free agent acquisitions that the Oakland Athletics couldn't afford. Put another way, the 2004 Red Sox were Moneyball with some actual money, and eventually, the whole thing started to click into place. A big part of the strategy for the Moneyball A's was always to keep the team in contention until July or so, and then add the pieces that would get them to the next level at the trade deadline. That plan is what led to the famous 20-game win streak in the A's 2002 season, and the similar run the Red Sox would go on a couple of years later. With the retooled infield and a more settled pitching rotation, the Red Sox went on an absolute tear, winning 20 of 22 games between August 16th and September 8th, and in the process, cutting the Yankees' lead in the division from 10.5 games to just 2. And that was an accomplishment all on its own. From getting dropped out of the playoffs to their rivals on the last pitch of the season, to losing their most beloved player at the trade deadline, to having to continually stare up at a seemingly insurmountable deficit in the AL East, the Red Sox overcame a lot to even make it to the 2004 playoffs. They could just keep the faith, and the Sox might have a chance in October. But as you may be aware, that faith would get pushed to the absolute limit before the season ended. The Red Sox wound up taking the wildcard spot with 98 wins, and then promptly swept the AL West champion Angels in the division series behind a Game 3 walk-off from David Ortiz. Like I said earlier, these guys had a pretty strong flair for the dramatic, and with the Yankees beating the Twins in their divisional matchup, the Sox were going to get the most dramatic situation possible to try and make it to the World Series. But hey, they'd been the hottest team in baseball for the last month of the season, so what did they have to be afraid of? Turns out, kind of a lot, actually. The Yankees had the best record in the American League in 2004, and in Game 1 of the ALCS, they scored 6 runs on Curt Schilling, the Red Sox best pitcher, en route to a 10-7 Game 1 win. But that was just one game, and it was in Yankee Stadium, so it wasn't that big of a deal, right? Well, it might not have been had the Red Sox not dropped Game 2 the next night with Pedro Martinez on the mound. Not ideal, but the series was headed back to Fenway, where the Sox had the second best home record in the league that season. That could have been exactly the boost they needed to get back in the series. But it doesn't really matter where you're playing if you give up 19 runs. Almost as quickly as the series had gotten going, the Yankees were threatening to knock the Red Sox out in the ALCS for the second consecutive season, only this time in an absolutely humiliating sweep. But Boston had already been down big to this Yankees team once this season, and had come all the way back to make it a serious fight. Surely, they could do it again.
Ortiz in the deep right field. Back is Sheffield. We'll see you later tonight.
This moment gets a lot of attention because, again, these guys had a flair for the dramatic, but it was the overall approach that I want to take a look at. For this to even be possible, mid-season acquisition Dave Roberts had to steal an absolutely crucial base in the ninth to be in a position to score the tying run. Otherwise, the Ortiz home run never happens. The roster moves that drew so much criticism over the course of the season were now keeping that season alive, and not for nothing, that game-tying single was hit by Bill Miller, the same guy who did this back in July. Mariano Rivera would scare the pants off of most guys in moments like these, but Miller had taken him deep a couple months before in almost the exact same situation, so what was he going to be afraid of? The 2004 Red Sox had a ton of talent, but I would argue that their mentality was what helped them pull this off more than anything else. Game 5 was another tight one, but down 2 runs in the bottom of the 8th, the Red Sox once again proved to be one of the clutchest baseball teams ever. After David Ortiz hit another homer to cut the lead to 1, Jason Varitek hit a sacrifice fly off of Mariano Rivera to tie it, and in the 14th, the Red Sox walked it off again in extra innings on a David Ortiz bloop single, nearly 6 hours after the first pitch was thrown. Game 6 was the Curt Schilling Bloody Sock game, with a confusing Mark Bellhorn home run as a fun little bonus to tie the series at 3. And although I don't know how the Yankees could have possibly pulled themselves together enough to win Game 7 after all that, Johnny Damon's grand slam in the second inning pretty much guaranteed that they weren't going to. And that was it. Just like that, the Red Sox, who had trailed these Yankees by more than 10 games with 6 weeks left to play in the season, were the American League champions. It was weird, and it was wild, but that was exactly how this Red Sox team did their best work. After pulling that off against the Yankees, not even the Cardinals, who had prime Albert Pujols and the best record in the majors that season, stood a chance against Boston. They were on a galactic-level hot streak at that point, and as such, they beat the Cardinals in 4 games to win their first World Series in 86 years. So, how did the 2004 Red Sox pull this off? How did they not only beat the Yankees, but also beat all the narrative that came with them? This was a team and a fan base that had been tortured by that narrative for years. So, how did they finally break that cycle? I would argue that it was by making bold decisions, committing to a new way of thinking, facing up to their own failure, and eventually creating their own narrative. You can't do something different until you start doing things differently. And say what you will about Moneyball and how the Red Sox built this roster, but however it happened, they did do things differently, and it worked. Curses like the one that haunted Boston fans for all that time are not, strictly speaking, real, but good team building and mental resilience are. And eventually, those things are what won the Red Sox their first title since 1918. Did the 2004 Red Sox do the impossible? Kinda. They came back from a 3-0 deficit in the playoffs, and they're still the only team to ever do that. But they were eventually able to do the seemingly impossible because they first did the highly insightful and practical, and they kept faith in those ideas even when things got hard. And if you're willing to do that, you just might have a chance of pulling off something spectacular. Hello everyone, I'm so glad that you're still here. I worked really hard on this video, and it makes me very happy to know that there are people willing to watch the whole thing. I'm Will, and if this is your first time here, then allow me to introduce my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about sports psychology and culture. We've got several videos about baseball here on the channel, including one about the contract year effect, the Giants dynasty in the 2010s, and the Moneyball A's, so if you're a fan of that sport like I am, there's plenty more to sink your teeth into while you're here. I'll have something new for you in a little while, but for the moment, I'm out of here like that home run David Ortiz hit in Game 4 of the ALCS. Until next time, I'm Will. Bye.